And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Community Solutions Summit. Our final session of the day is diversity, equity, and inclusion on nonprofit boards. And a sort of rhetorical question, are we there yet? I'm going to be speaking and moderating, so please excuse all the glitches that I'm sure are about to occur. Just a little bit of housekeeping stuff, and then I'll introduce the other speakers. If you would like to be on camera, please do. We would love to see you. If not, that's fine too. If you wouldn't mind entering your name and your organization in chat. We're trying to keep a record of who's been on the calls. If you are not muted, please mute yourself unless you're invited to speak. This is a safe place, so we ask that you be respectful of yourself and others. If you've got any questions, we decided we were gonna save them all for the end. So if you've got questions, please put them in chat and we'll pull them out as we toward the end of the session so we can answer those. Closed captioning is enabled. So if you need that feature, you need to, down at the bottom of your screen, there's a little button that says more with 3 dots. And if you hover over that, you should be able to enable the live transcript function. This session is being recorded. All session materials and the recording will be made available to you after the event. We're looking at probably about a week out because there's our sessions that we're doing today and tomorrow, plus all the other state association sessions. And so all of those are going to be available to you next week. Finally, at the end of the session, we're going to be ask you to complete a 3-question evaluation of the session. So please make sure you give us a second or so of your time and do that for us. So again, I'm Terry Chelikowski, Executive Director of the Florida Alliance of CDCs, or the now known as the Florida Alliance for Community Solutions. And I'm going to be opening up the session today. And then I will be followed by Charles Harris, who's with Central Florida Community Action Agency, who is also a member of the board of the Florida Alliance of CDCs, but he's got some, the National Community Actions have done some great work in this area. And so Charles is going to share some of the information from them. And finally, Janet Hamer, who is also on my board, imagine that, is on the board. Janet, you're the chair, are you not, of the National Disabilities Institute? And so she will be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a slightly different perspective from the disabled community. So any questions before we get going? I'm going to attempt to share my screen and kick us off. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, so we are good to go. So I wanted to give you a little bit, just to sort of base the conversation. At the Alliance, we've been talking about this for a while. In 2018, our national organization put out a book called Talking Values, and talking about diversity was one of the big topics in there. And so we've been trying to include it in all of our conferences and our trainings since that time. And then in 2019, our board said, you know what, this just needs to be a core value for the Alliance. You know, this is too critical. It's too important to the communities that, you know, the organizations and the communities that they serve, that this needs to be a core value for us. So starting in 2019 and through 2020, we held a number of various workshops around social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion terminology, institutional racism, a variety of different things. And then this year, you know, in part of our work plan, we decided that we really needed to do something, you know, with this. So actually, we planned it for 2020, but you know what happened there. So this year, our board, we hired a consultant to come in and who worked with the board on an assessment. She helped us go through a sort of a DEI organizational capacity assessment, and the board was really worked hard on this and came back, and they basically, what they did was they took our work plan and looked at it all through the SMART methodology, which is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound, but with a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. So what we did then was, the result of all that was that we found ourselves looking at everything that we do using these three questions. All right, so is what we're providing to the members, is it inclusive of all of the members' differences? Because, we're a statewide organization, right? So we've got a pretty diverse membership. So we need to ask ourselves, is what we're providing really valuable and practical and useful to them? Do the processes and committee structures reflect the diversity of our members in their community? And finally, how do we ensure that consultants and speakers or anybody that we bring in from the outside helps us amplify our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, so that we're not just operating in a vacuum. We're really, really attempting to get some things done. So we decided this year that we would launch a training program. And the idea there was that we would get together, we would ask organizations if they were interested in this, which we'd already determined that there was a great deal of interest. So we sent out a survey, we composed a survey with the help of All Things Diverse, who's been helping us with this. And it went out to our nonprofit members. So it didn't go out to our financial institution partners, or it did go to the CDFIs though, because they're nonprofits. And we basically just wanted to know, where they were on this continuum of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The survey was sent to primarily leadership staff. So it went to executive directors or associate directors, or folks at the higher level, and we asked them to share the survey with board members, other volunteers, and staff. So what we found out then, after we got the survey done, and we held our first session of the training program, and that was to actually look at the results of the survey. And what we found was that 50% of the respondents have had some sort of DEI training at work. So the organizations are saying, yeah, we need to be doing something here. 75%, and these are the people that responded, saw strong leadership support within their organization. So the staff or the executive leadership and the boards really appear to be stepping up. And these numbers I thought were fantastic. 91% believe that their employees, 83% of their board members, and 75% of the organizational leadership effectively mirror the community that they serve. So, I don't know how many organizations can really say that they're doing such a good job with this already. But I think it's probably been in the forefront of people's minds for some time. So maybe we shouldn't be so surprised. The second part of the training program was to provide tools to help our organization members begin this DEI journey, figure out where they were. I have to tell you that initially, when we did the survey, we thought that we were going to have two distinct groups, people that were just a little bit, had just started the DEI conversation, and other organizations that were much further along. And what we found when we got the survey results back was that wasn't really the case, that people are doing something, but everybody's still pretty much at a low level, at a really sort of at the beginning line of this process. So we thought we'd end up having a couple of different cohorts, and instead we ended up with one group that worked together throughout the program. So we convened these folks, and they were we had a great training session, and we provided some tools to help them start the conversation. So the first session really was looking at the survey results, and the next session, was more about what does this really mean. So one of the documents that we provided them with was a diversity profile activity, which basically is a great little tool. It says, do you have any Black neighbors? Do you have an Asian neighbor? Do you have a Black colleague? Do you have an Hispanic colleague? And it went through all these just regular little life situations, and when I got done with it, I was appalled that I was not living in as diverse a neighborhood as I thought I was. So, I mean, if you can't start a conversation with something like that, then, you need a little bit of help. But that was one of the tools that we provided. And then there was a partnership model that asked them to talk about the organization's vision, their challenges, their resources, and then look at that stuff as you're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. How do those structural things impact the work that you're doing or the work that you would like to do there? Finally, the whole thing was based on the SMART methodology, which again is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound. So we provided examples of a goal, actually of several different goals, and help walk them through the process of answering the questions, and figuring that stuff out. So that was, and then people were asked actually to create one or two goals, and using the SMART methodology to work those all out and come up with actual action steps that they could use. So that was pretty much the end of the training program, and then we evaluated them and to see what was really working. And 100% of them agreed that they were much better informed about diversity, equity, and inclusion and the SMART methodology than they were before they started. 100% found the homework assignments really useful. And 75% strongly agreed that the Alliance should have similar sessions in the future, which was good news, because we think that there's a real need for this amongst the membership, because we want to help them figure out where their organizations need to go. In addition to the basic stuff, we did get a few comments on the evaluations, and I wanted to share those because I think that these are also important. People want to go to the next level. This was interesting, but what's next? What are the next steps? We've got some ideas here, we've had some discussions, but how do I really make this happen at my organization? Where is there an inexpensive source, a resource, a facilitator that could come in and run focus groups for us, so that we can really make this move internally. A couple of people said, I really wish more staff would have participated in this, and staff at all levels, not just the executive leadership, but they wanted to see line staff and everybody else engaged in the conversation. And finally, people really enjoyed the experience, and they enjoyed the energy and really found it pretty valuable, which was all great, but it leaves us with a few questions. So like, where do we go next? This was sort of a pilot program for us this year. So we want to learn lessons and learn good lessons from that. So tentatively, what we're thinking about is that we would go back and interview the respondents, because not everybody that participated in the survey actually joined the conversation, the focus groups. So we're thinking that we might want to go back and just ask everybody a couple of questions about, if they did participate, what was the best thing they found? What was the worst thing? If they didn't participate, why? Why didn't they? I mean, they did the survey, but then when it came right down to it, they didn't want to go through the program. And then we're going to use the information that we gathered to help us design, what a program would look like for the future. And then to identify resources that can help us deliver a program that is going to be really beneficial to the members and help them not just on a one-time thing, but as a consistent, ongoing part of their governance and organizational structure, to be asking themselves always, these questions, is what we're doing meeting the needs of everybody in our community? Are we reflective of the community, and making sure that we can help them get this information and do better for their neighborhoods and their organizations. So that was all I had.
Okay, thank you, Terry. It's now my turn to take a minute here, and let me do a share screen, and hopefully this will. Okay, can everyone see that fine?
Great, Charles, thanks.
Okay, again, welcome everyone to this late session. We are very happy that you have taken time to join us. We hope that we are able to provide you some information that you can go back to your boards and share with not only your nonprofit board, for other organizations that you may be associated with as well. And I'm Charles Harris, CEO of Central Florida Community Action Agency. And a little bit about myself here, again, CEO of Central Florida Community Action Agency, which is a community, a federally funded community-based group, nonprofit. We have board members representing 3 counties in North Central Florida. I personally spent over 25 years as a board member of Central Florida Community Action Agency, and served in various roles among boards, chair, vice chair, secretary, and treasurer, among numerous nonprofits. Currently serve on the board of directors for 6 nonprofits locally and statewide, which is again why I was very excited to be part of this process, this initiative here. And just because I like to brag a little bit, I am a retired professor emeritus from the College of Journalism and Communications at the University of Florida. Don't get a chance to say that often, so wanted to make sure I mentioned that. I did, in 2013, I transitioned from the university to serving as CEO of Central Florida Community Action Agency, and also proud vice chair of the board of directors for the Florida Alliance for Community Solutions. I'm going to approach this from a different perspective in that I'm going to talk about it from a more national outlook. And community action, we have a national organization called a National Community Action Partnership, which I will refer to as NCAP. And earlier this year, they held an equity summit with the theme of centering in truth, activating community healing and resilience. Resiliency. There were over 620 participants that were involved with the summit. And again, this is an example of, again, from a national perspective, but perhaps some things that you can take away and use at your local organization. Just an overview about this. Again, this was inspired by a National Board of Directors, and they actually had an Equity and Economic Mobility Commission to really start and really get the summit going. And as you can see, since 2007, NCAP has been actively engaged in issues related to DEI, and equity has always been one of the core values of NCAP. With the summit, there were 3 primary objectives that was used for the summit. One was becoming centered in the key concepts. Again, you see a lot of racial equity as part of this. That's because, again, our organization decided to use this as one of their focus areas. Also, it's important to engage in peer learning as part of the process, and again, connect organizations that are advancing equity. Before they started, I wanted to make sure that we all had a clear focus on definitions as we began our discussions, to make sure we're all on the same page. So we created sort of our own definitions of equity and belonging. Again, all of us have ways that we look at it, but from our national perspective, we looked at equity as a condition whereby all people have access, and regardless of race, culture, gender, and so forth. And also we talked about belonging. Belonging is the inclusive we, and the notion that all people, excuse me just a moment here, sorry about that, that all people in the circle of human concern, by treating all people with dignity and respect, we acknowledge our shared humanity and affirm that all people belong. So these are some definitions that we used to make sure that we all stayed on track, all stayed focused on our process. And prior to the summit, our national organization convened some what's called racial hearing circles. Basically what that was sharing stories that affirm our common unity, rather than talking about what separates us. The focus was on what we have in common. And prior to the racial healing circles, there was some touchstones, some agreements, group agreements that was agreed upon. One is that we'd be 100% present, that everyone would listen deeply and suspend judgments, that everyone would identify your assumptions, and also your biases, that you would speak your truth and be willing to listen deeply to the truth of others, always speak by invitation and respect the silence, maintain confidentiality, which is very important, and when things get difficult, turn to wonder why they become difficult. So again, it was a very deep dive and a very extensive process there. On the first day of the summit, there were some presentations held. One was called These Truths. Just a moment here, I'm keeping up with my slides here. With this one, this was a discussion about, there are over 60 college campuses across the country that have established truth, racial healing, and transformation centers. So Dr. Gail Christopher provided an update on that. Also, Feel a Moment was a discussion about race and health disparities, especially as they relate to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then Belonging, starting the end in mind, was a panel discussion that included discussion about America's institutions, basic human needs for belonging, and feeling a part of the whole. Continuing with those presentations, the last one for that day was one regarding the state of women in poverty, again regarding the intersection between women and the rates of poverty. You can see sort of the panel discussion that we had there. It was important that we try to include voices from all sectors. So again, we did have a young lady that works with National Asian American and Pacific Women's. So again, it was a full discussion of women and the intersection of poverty there. On the second day, the presentations began with reimagining the color of law, repurposing the problem. And this was really a discussion that was more about housing segregation and really the origin of redlining that many of us are familiar with. Next was a home away from home, embracing children and families without borders presentation. Again, this was more of a discussion about challenges faced by immigrant children and families pursuing the American dream. In addition to this, to the presentations were also various workshops, some that included disability justice, older adults, mentoring, and police reform. One of the other important aspects of the summit was taking time to have small group discussions called table talks. And so among those participants, they were broken up into groups that had an option of selecting which table talk discussion they wanted to join in. The first group was system tables, and basically talking about institutions, employment, workforce, narrative change, education, public safety. This was followed by people tables. So again, we wanted to break the group up into smaller groups. So again, that you could have those really personal discussions, opportunities to really get more in depth based upon some of the information that you heard from the presentations. So again, this was very important. This was probably the most engaging aspect of the summit, in that it allowed folks to really get some hands-on work as they opened up and started discussing various topics. And as it concluded, it concluded with a reflective session. And really the point I want to make here is that really there were no mandates from this summit. There were no position papers. There were no definitive conclusions, because that's not what it was about. It was about sharing information. It was about having ongoing discussions. It's about folks taking time, being honest with themselves, how they reflect back on not only their lives, but their communities. And again, it was important to establish open communication and non-judgmental ways for folks to have open discussions about a DEI. So again, let's say that your board has already reached that first step. You've got a diverse board. So what's next? Terry talked about some things that we through the Alliance felt that would be important for folks, but also we think it's important for you to go beyond just having those discussions and really taking deep dives and having open and honest discussions, because none of this works if folks are not willing to be open and honest with each other. And again, come away with not necessarily any conclusions, but just feel good about the fact that you've had a chance to share your ideas, that you've heard from others, and hopefully that's improved and increased your knowledge of DEI and how it impacts you, your life, and hopefully helps you as a board member. And that's it. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Janet.
Sorry,
Janet,
I
let's
forgot I
have you
was
on
muted.
mute.
That was me muting myself. All right, I'm gonna pull up Janet's presentation and we'll go from there.
All right. So most of you, I think, well, first of all, thank you all for being at a session that starts at 4:30 that does not have an ice cream break. I was talking about that at the last session, that I think one of the things I miss the most are the breaks from conferences. I know that makes me sound shallow, but nevertheless, we always had great food. Terry always had great food for us. And hopefully we'll be able to return to that.
Hopefully in 2022.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Janet Hamer. I am retired from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And also, to give a shout out to Rob, I'm retired from the TD Bank. I decided that I had to go into the private sector for just a couple of years before I retired. I've been retired for 3 years. And the thing about retirement for all of you who are still working is that once you retire, then you can work even harder at volunteer activities. So I'm very privileged to be the board chair of the National Disability Institute, which is a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., although I think we have about 35 staff scattered around the entire country. I've been on the board for about 8 years, and I've been the board chair for the last 3 years. NDI was founded 15 years ago, a little bit more than 15 years ago. Terry, could you go to the next slide, please? Terry, next slide. There you go. Okay. So we are really the only, I think we're the only national organization that's dedicated to building a better economic future for people with disabilities. We work with financial empowerment with persons with disabilities. And what I'd like to discuss with you today, and hopefully when you leave, you'll have a better understanding of this, that there's when you're building a board, when you're being diverse, you really need to think about including persons with disabilities. So NDI, basically, we do public education, we do research, and you're going to see some of our research. We have a really incredible, very small, but very mighty research staff. We do a lot of policy development on the federal level. We're working right now on CRA, as all of you are probably thinking about the new the changes that the 3 regulators are proposing. We worked with OCC when they went their own way with their changes, and we were very proud that for the first time in the history of the CRA regulations, persons with disabilities were actually included in the regulations. We do trainings, we do technical assistance, and we launch a lot of initiatives. Next slide, please, Terry. So in the last couple of years, we've launched a new Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development. And that's basically to build awareness in the bank regulatory community, the financial services community, and the nonprofit community that serves persons with disabilities, how that they need to start working on more partnerships so they can be an integral part of all community development activities and work in the communities that all of you work in. Next slide, please. So disability inclusive community development is basically assuring that all persons are included in the planning and implementing of activities, projects, and programs that promote the well-being of a community. And this includes affordable housing, workforce development, financial capability. It's an approach that assures the well-being of everyone in a community. And one of the things, I'm going to show the graphs in a minute, we started talking about the intersection of poverty, race, and disabilities in 2016. And by 2017, we had developed our first research on the intersection of race and disabilities. And part of that was that we're serving the same people, that the disability community needs to be at the table with all of the community development organizations around the country. Next slide, please. So if you look at this graph, I think we have really cutting edge research. It's really interesting. So this is the poverty rate of working age population by race, ethnicity, and disability. And if you look at this, and all of the blue graphs are persons with disabilities. So they're overwhelmingly higher than any of the groups of persons without disabilities. But if you look at this overwhelmingly, if you look at persons with disabilities that are also Black, you have 36%. That's an incredible amount of the population in many of our communities, right? You look at Latino, you look at the indigenous people. It's really a staggering number that I think is often kind of lost when we talk about poverty rates and working in our communities. And one of these also that's interesting, I think is really interesting about this, we're trying to figure out, because we knew that there's a price for being disabled, right? There's an absolute price. It's like kind of like a surcharge for being disabled, having a household that has one or more members that are disabled. Because if you think about this and the wide variety of disabilities, and I don't want to leave out the hidden disabilities. We're not just talking about physical disabilities, we're also talking about the hidden disabilities that often people do not self-disclose because they don't want anyone to know. But we're talking about persons with mental illness, persons with substance abuse problems, all those kinds of things that are often hidden. When we started this research on trying to put a price tag on the cost of being a disabled person and on the household of a person with disability. The cost of disability, according to our research, is a staggering $17,690 more a year for a household than as a person with disability. Or if you look at the median income of a household, it's about 28%. It costs about 28% more to be able to provide the services and needs for a person with disability. And if you think about this, you think about someone who may not be able to drive. And there may not be public transportation, because we know public transportation is not always accessible or available. So you think about that. You think about the assistive technology. We talk a lot about assistive technology grants for folks who need screen readers for their computers, all sorts of different things. And that's a cost, right? So if you look at this, I think this is even more staggering than the poverty, the net worth by race, ethnicity, and disability. So if you look at that, you can now think about why we as the National Disability Institute is pushing the idea of having persons with disabilities at the table at community-based organizations, because they have their own unique needs, but they're also part of the community that often are not at the table. Next slide, Terry. So I tried to get a map of a city in Florida. We thought we had one and we didn't. And as I said, we have a small but mighty research staff. So this is a map, an overlay of LMI areas in St. Louis, Missouri. Map 1 is LMI areas, and map 2 is areas with disability as a high percentage of the population. So if you look at this, and we've done this in other cities in the country. So if you look at this, you can see that LMI communities are the same as communities that have a disproportionate number of individuals with disabilities. And why is that? Because if you go back to the graphs, individuals with disabilities are disproportionately lower income. They have lower net worth, and they live in poverty. So next slide, please. So here is some research that I think you would find interesting. As I said, we started talking about the intersection of race and disability in 2016. 2017, we did our first paper on financial inequality, disability, race, and poverty in America. And we just updated that in 2020. And no surprise, it hasn't, we don't have a lot of positive findings. It's still a huge problem. But these are, I think that this is something that is really interesting, and it should be interesting to community-based groups because it shows that intersection. And what I would say is that when we're looking at the diversity of boards for our community-based organizations, we really need to consider persons with disabilities on that board. I mean, and this is something that even disability boards struggle with. We've struggled with that on our own board. About 50% of our board is a person with disability. The remainder of our board is probably, most of them at least have a close family member with a disability. But it's absolutely important that persons with disabilities be considered when you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion on boards. Next slide, Terry. So please visit our website. We're also, and it's not launched yet, we talked about this last night, but we are launching an equity portion of our website. And we will be doing a lot more research. We also, a plug here, I guess this is a commercial, we're also doing training, regional trainings for financial institutions, community-based organizations, and organizations in particular who work with persons with disabilities to encourage partnerships, talk to them about best practices around the country. We're actually, I think, doing about 5 of those in the next few months. We did one in Florida about a year and a half ago, very well received, and we're hoping to be able to come back and do another one. But I think it's incredibly important. Persons with disabilities for too long have kind of lived in the shadows, but they're part of our communities. They're a vital part of our communities. When we're doing housing projects, when we're doing workforce development, we need to consider the needs of persons with disabilities, as we do with anyone. So that is my presentation. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Janet. So we have a couple of questions in the box, but I was actually hoping to maybe prompt a little bit of a conversation. We don't have a very big group. There's only a dozen or so. So I have a question for any of you, any of the participants. What are you doing with your organization, with your board around diversity, equity, and inclusion? If you want to put your hand up, I can call on you. Because I am curious to hear what other people are doing. Nobody's doing anything, huh?
I'll just,
Go ahead, Janet.
It's really hard work. It was probably about 4 years ago, before I became board chair of NDI, we started talking about diversity and inclusion because, quite frankly, our board was not that diverse and not that inclusive. And even when it came to persons with disabilities, our board chair was a person with disability, but we really did not have we needed to diversify our board in many ways, in every way possible, because we needed to have all of those voices. We are almost there, but it took a long time, and it took a lot of conversation. It's not easy, and I think part of it's not easy because we don't want to admit that we aren't diverse and inclusive. That's just, I mean, that's an honest, just being honest. I mean, we used to have a 2-day in-person meeting every year, and literally, I think it was 2017, 2018, we actually took at least half of the 1 day discussing how we had to become more diverse and inclusive to serve persons with disabilities.
Anita Jenkins has her hand up. Anita, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I know for our board, we've been meeting virtually, but we've been encouraging members to seek training. We've shared some written documents with them, trying to educate board members. And we took a hiatus for the summer, and we're planning a retreat in November, and that will be one of the topics. But we also keep a census of our board members with a sense of diversity among a number of different categories, not just race, but also age, around neighborhood, et cetera, looking at different factors, retired as opposed to working, just a number of different things that we try to have a mix so that we have different perspectives on our board from our neighborhood to reflect the neighborhood.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. I see Mr. Samuels, you put a couple of questions in the chat box there. You want to go ahead and ask one of those?
Well,
we have a new one.
Okay, well, let me start off. My name's Douglas Samuels. Also, like Professor Harris, I used to be a professor and the vice president for student affairs at Portland State University, and I was the associate dean for student affairs and diversity at Vermont Law School prior to that position. And I worked in higher education for about 30 years. And I've been a consultant for about 10 years of my own company, mostly working with colleges and universities. But over the past 6 years, I've been doing some more victim advocacy work for the state of Washington for the long-term care program in the state. Every state has a long-term care program mandated by Congress from the 1970s. And I'm in a new position. I just accepted back in March of this year to be the deputy director for the Community for Positive Aging, which used to be the Hollywood Senior Center in Portland, Oregon. And coming in, very surprised, much DEI was not taking place, but the executive director, Amber Kearns, brought in a vice president from Unpuck Bank, who's the vice president for diversity and equity. And I've noticed over time, and maybe Professor Harris could probably speak to this too, but many of corporations and business establishments and housing organizations are creating these DEI positions. And there's an opportunity right there if you can get a hold of one of those folks and have a relationship with these banks or corporations or businesses, you might be able to get them to have their vice president come in and do some training for your board. So this vice president came in and did some DEI training in the fall, not only with the board, but the advisory board, which I directly advise and then work closely with the executive director with the board. And the DEI training was not only for the board, but it was also for the staff. The challenge is that staff turnover, board members turn over. So the question to me, as in the box, is how do you bring folks on DEI? This is a mostly predominantly white institution, the Hollywood Senior Center. I'm not sure people are very familiar with Portland, Oregon, but there was, just like most major cities, there were a lot of redlining going on and a lot of separation going on the past 100 years. And you can't overcome that overnight. There's been a lot of gentrification that have been occurring in mostly Black neighborhoods. I've been in Portland, Oregon for over 20 years, and I've watched the Black neighborhood, or the so-called Black neighborhood that was set up basically through redlining from a flood back in the 1920s, become very gentrified. But you have the Urban League on that side of town, NAACP, and a whole other bunch of Black organizations. But then on the other side of town, where I chose to work, because I've worked mostly at predominantly white institutions, but I attended an HBCU, much like Professor Harris, he understands what's going on college campuses. And we tend to be at the forefront of DEI in the country at colleges and universities. Before the rest of the country catches up, we've already kind of beat each other up and been through our challenges in different academic departments and worked really hard to have an integrated college campus for our students when they arrive, so that they can flourish and thrive. And I take the same approach to working with older folks that are in our program at the Hollywood Center, the Community for Positive Aging, which just got changed. Anyway, of course, I'm interested in data gathering and outcomes. Part of the reason that the deputy director hired me is because I have that background of evaluation, assessment, and research. As Professor Harris knows, you won't be on a college campus unless you, in the role he was in, or the role that I was in, without a terminal degree. And that you know how to do research. So everybody's usually a little overwhelmed with us academic people, because we have an extensive background that most people in social services don't have. And we tend to come in with a very distinct perspective, much like Professor Harris's presentation today. I felt like I was in the classroom with him for a few minutes, and that was quite enjoyable. So
Doug, I'm sorry, but we've got some other questions too.
Oh, sure.
So I just
Okay.
wanted to ask you, in the chat you put in, basically your first question was, how do you onboard new board members?
Right.
With a DEI focus. And so I was going to ask Charles or Janet, or actually anybody on the call, have you worked on this at your organization? Have you got any experiences that you could share?
I will say that, again, being an executive director, that it started with us before the onboarding process, in that we were very deliberate in making sure that we bring in a diverse group to represent our board. So actually, when it came to the onboarding process, there was very little discussion of DEI at that time, because the board that was coming in is very diverse. And again, we have all sectors of the community represented, low income, the public sector, private sector, also racially diverse as an organization, race by gender and so forth. So again, it was a deliberate initiative by us to, as we brought in new members, to make sure that we were very diverse. So again, the onboarding process was not really integral to what we were doing, because we had already done some things on the front end for that.
Okay, well, on this end, what I'm trying to get to, thank you, Professor Harris, is that when you're in a predominantly white city, white state, unlike Florida, or some of the other diverse states where you have a more diverse population, it's not so easy to find board members from diverse backgrounds that can have contributions. So if you're in a white institution like a university, or a white institution like a senior center, and we also have low-income housing, we don't have that much diversity to pick from. People of color tend to get, and other people with disabilities, and gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people, they tend to get used across the city or across various boards. So how do you folks look at making sure you're not repeating with people, the same people going to the board?
I've got this one. I've got this one. We
Great.
had a session earlier today. I don't know if you attended with
No, I had
Casey
to go
Gilbert.
back into my job.
Oh, okay, because we had
not.
we had a great session earlier today on
Great.
recruiting great board members.
Right.
And one of the tips was get out of your comfort zone. And
Right.
I live in Florida now. I used to live in Ohio, both fairly diverse states. But I've certainly been to Oregon, and I understand, the issue that you've got. There just isn't a whole lot of diversity to pick from.
That's right.
But one of the things that Dr. Gilbert brought up was, you got to get out of your comfort zone. So, because it's the same people, right? You serve on a board and you see the same people on all these different boards. So don't ask those people, go
Right.
to some
Right.
of your, go to some of your
Right.
line staff and ask them who they know.
But
Go
you
to your
can't do that. You
financial
can't do-
institution and
I'm
talk,
sorry, you can't do
you
that
know,
in
just
Oregon because
to,
you don't have people of color. See, that's why
I,
you don't have people of color. You can't go to your line staff. It's a small organization of only about 15 staff members.
Mhm.
And you haven't been doing that sort of outreach as an organization. So you don't have those networks. And the people that work for you, they had to go through the diversity training in order to bring them up to snuff with DEI. So you're
Yeah.
basically starting from ground zero. You can't get out of your comfort zone if you're not pushed to the comfort zone during the training, and then look around and say, who do I know that looks like Douglas? Oh, I don't know anybody.
Douglas, send me your email. Send me your email. We'll hook you up. We'll hook you up with somebody that you can
Thank you
bounce
so
some
much.
ideas off of.
Yes, thank you very much.
We did have
Appreciate
another question from, who was this? Oh, this was from Pat Lee, and I think this might be for you, Charles. When you had the people tables,
Right.
were the people that sat at those tables only people that fit within the description? You know, so if the Latinx table was only Latinx, or?
No. What they were given opportunity to sit at a table where that would be the primary discussion. There were
Gotcha.
from that area, but again, it was not made just of that group, for example, because again, it was an opportunity to hear. And what the national network did actually, what they actually did was they made sure that there was one, for lack of a better term, representative there that would sort of lead the discussion and talk about those things that perhaps others may not be willing to bring up. But then it was just sharing their concerns, sharing their biases, and just an open discussion period, really, with no conclusions on anything.
Okay. We have another question from Sandra Maureen. Sandra?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment because I did sit through the DEI for Community Training Works and Young American Conservation Corps.
Hmm.
My background is pharmacy, which means that over a large section of the city of Jacksonville, I worked with different ethnic groups and different people at different times. So the idea of diversity and inclusion as it relates to a change management model, which is kind of what we're doing now, because we're moving closer to trying to understand the culture of individuals that are sitting in need. If we're trying to do a board, and the board is a commensurate of a wide, diverse audience, but we are a audience of people who represent a wide audience of people, but they are governing or making suggestions for a corporation that does hire over a big group of people that are different, then your board basically is not going to have effective outcomes if your HR person is not well trained in DEI, so that they can be they can train occupationally, they can identify needs in order for your work to be completed, because generally you're on a time frame with whatever the situation is, and whatever corporation you're working with, that corporation is on a time frame for completion of the job. So when you think of a DEI that is effective for every corporation, you got to now think of a DEI that actually moves into the corporation in real time. So, and I'm not sure if I'm explaining this correctly, but you're looking as a board operator to complete your tasks and reach your goal. Community Training Works motto is teaching by doing, by teaching, or teaching by doing. I can't remember right now. But they take a group of young people into the forest to clear the forest. So let's say they have a square mile that they have to clear in 2 weeks. To effectively be able to give, as a board member, to give them what they need in order for them to have successful outcomes with the DEI training, we've got to move DEI into a situation that accounts for all the components that their employees had in order to gain the camaraderie that the employee needs to complete the task. So dealing with a handicapped employee, or dealing with a mentally ill employee, or dealing with an employee who has a different cultural background is some of the things that you come across when you get into real time. And I don't want to go too far into this, but I did sit through it, and I thought that the DEI training that we got with the organization that you are speaking of, Terry, was effective.
Thank you. Sandra was one of the participants in our pilot diversity, equity, inclusion organizational assessment training program. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I want to say one other thing.
Okay, because we got another question.
Yeah, just a second. I also, because I'm president of Jacksonville Gullah Geechee Nation Community Development Corporation, which is a corporation that actually identifies people who are descendants from the enslaved population in Jacksonville. That DEI training that they did may not work for every board. So we may have to reassess how we look at that. And I'm
Very
done.
valid point, Sandra. Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a question from Natasha. Could you discuss what the process would look like for an organization to create a board selection process / vetting process that doesn't gatekeep for certain members of the community, formal education levels, prior professional experience, et cetera? I'll take a quick stab at that. We keep, and I think Anita mentioned this earlier, we have a board matrix document that we use. It asks in a very tiny space about 50 questions. And I have to be honest, education isn't really in there. It's we ask race and ethnicity and age and gender but we ask what skills they have, what kinds of experiences, life experiences they have. As the executive director of the organization, when my nominations committee gets together, I can say, look, I've gone through the board matrix, and here, we really need, a person that meets, this kind of description. But it's not, they don't have to have a master's degree. We're looking for somebody that's got marketing experience, and it could be a teenager who's just like the most amazing social media person you ever met. But I think the issue you're raising is something we talked about also in our last session when it comes to just looking for employees. Maybe we need to take a step back and kind of rethink how we define the skill sets that we want from our board members. Janet or Charles, you have anything?
Yeah, I just want to add, one of the things that I was told by one of my former board chairs is that, when you're looking for board members, outside of all the other items we've mentioned here, really you're looking for folks who either are decision makers or have influence. And sometimes we get the influence, those who have influence confused with decision makers. And someone with influence could be that grandmother that sits on that porch that knows everything that goes on in that community. She has all of the contacts. She can tell you everything. But again, sometimes they overlook if you really are too specific and looking for, again, as the person mentioned, that formal education and so forth. So you have to sort of broaden your view when you're starting to take a look at prospective members. And again, look at not only, as Terry mentioned, the skill set, but also what else can they bring? And are they people that are in decision-making process? Are they people that have influence with that community so they can connect you with resources or keep your programs very active and involved in the community?
I realize that probably NDI is a national organization. It's not exactly the same thing, and we're lucky because we can go anywhere in the country and find board members. But we've, in the last couple of years, because we've tried to be very thoughtful about this, we've established a leadership committee that's all they do. They meet monthly and they talk about what we need, what we don't have, the gaps, be they, geographic, ethnic, racial, persons with disabilities, what they could bring to the board in terms of skill sets. And we identify that, and then we look for the individuals. And we've been very deliberate also that because we don't want to make that ask and get people. We interview people, the leadership committee, they're tough. They interview people that are potential candidates, tell them, the duties and everything. And then we have a formal onboarding that we've just established, which is about an hour and a half to 2 hours, where we bring in different senior staff to talk about our programs and to talk about the strategic plan and the mission of the organization. So and that's really been effective in the last couple of years, because before it was like, oh, okay, well, I know somebody over here, and they might be a great board member, and then some of them that were great board members, but others never showed up. So, I think you have to be very deliberate. And I like the idea of engaging other board members, having them own this process.
Thank you, Janet. Well, we are at 5:31, and Janet, before we do go, I would like, if you would be happy to share maybe an outline for that process, that might be something that we can share with the folks on this call.
Okay, I will. I'm not sure what we have, but
got something like that might be helpful for, at least for the thinking process for the folks that joined us today. So I want to say thank you, all of you, for hanging in here until 5:30. We really appreciate it. I know, Douglas, it's not 5:30 in Oregon, so
Right.
Yeah, I suspect you're going to a few more sessions later on. So,
One more session, one more. That's it, and then it's done at 3:30.
Okay, so don't forget that we're here tomorrow. We start at 10:30 in the morning with a great session on engaging youth for our future, and then our membership meeting at noon, and great sessions in the afternoon. So we will see everybody tomorrow morning at 10:30. Thank you so much for your attention, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.